call maybe another method, for example. So if I want to call a method like add, or add something in, we have something like this. So let's go ahead and create a test class for lab calculator. It doesn't have a lot in it, but we can add to this class, and then you'll get a feeling for JUnit testing. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm in this project already, I'm going to hit File, New, and I can hit JUnit test case. So it's going to do one thing, it's going to pull up a wizard here. It's going to ask me first which version of JUnit I want to use. So not JUnit 3, that's not a number that we're interested in. JUnit 4 is a good option. JUnit Jupyter Test is also an option, but this is only an option on Oxygen. So if you'll notice on your VDIs, you have Eclipse Mars, and I have Eclipse Oxygen installed because that's the latest. I want to make sure I bridge all of the things. So if you're using on your VDI and on your home computer, and you have Mars here and Oxygen there, they won't play well together. And additionally, if you kind of share with other people, especially in your team project, it may not play well together. So we're going to use JUnit 4 in all of our examples, and I encourage you to do the same, either 4 or 5, whichever one shows up for you, instead of JUnit Jupyter or 3. These are really important. And in the lab, I remind you of this, it says only 4 or 5, do not choose other versions. So what it's going to ask you for is, what's the source folder? So this is my package name, Hello World, and the source folder is fine. I can add a package if I want to. I'm just going to leave it. I'll probably do a test package, for example. And then I can have a name. And the name by default is it's gonna choose the highlighted class and add the word test to the end of that class name. So I got lab calculator test by default. And then I'm going to be able to select some things down here. So I'm not going to select those yet. I'll talk about those here in a second. But instead down here it's going to say class under test and ask me which one, and it pre-populated all this information because I had already clicked on lab calculator. So this is the way to do it for 2 reasons. One, it pre-populated this whole thing, so the only thing I needed to do was hit this button and maybe enter a package name if I didn't already have a separate package there. And then I hit finish. And what it does, number 2, is it's going to link JUnit with this project. So are we ready? On the side where Hello World shows, you can see that there's no JavaFX kind of project. You'll see this JRE system library. This is linked with my project right now. I have a source folder, some documentation. I'm going to hit finish here. It's going to ask me for something. It says JUnit 4 is not found in the build path. Do you want to add it? We're going to leave this the way that it is. It says perform the following action, add JUnit 4 library to the build path. This is really important because what it means is this project's now going to support JUnit. It's going to import all of the library requirements for me. If I did this on my own and I wrote just the Java code into a regular class, none of this linking would happen. So that's why the wizard's really important. So I'm going to click OK, and that's it. So now it automatically added this JUnit 4 down here as a dependency. Dependencies in our projects mean that we have a requirement for this framework to be in there. So if I use JUnit in my project, I have to include the JUnit dependency. We saw the same thing in JavaFX, but again, Eclipse handled that for us. In all of your Eclipse JavaFX projects, like Hello JavaFX, for example, you'll notice there's the JRE system library and JavaFX SDK. So these little symbols here mean that they're little libraries or jars that are kind of configured and set. And I have the same now in Hello World, which is just a regular Java project, one for the JRE system library, and now one for JUnit 4. So they're linked to my project. So if I go to put code from JUnit into my project without doing this process, and I just create something by default, it's not going to import all the right libraries, and I won't have that added to the build path. That'll be an issue. So you'll notice there's nothing really special about this class. It just says lab calculator test. There's no special kind of class. It didn't change this. There's no polymorphism or inheritance here. It's just a regular class. We have this little @ annotation again, @test. We use those in FXML to denote something that links back over to our FXML document. In this case, we're going to use them to link back over and indicate that it's a JUnit test case of some sort. So I can put whatever methods I want in this class because it's a regular class, but if they don't have this annotation, or one of the 5 other ones that we're going to talk about in a second, then it won't be something that is executed in the JUnit test case. So I can have helper methods in here that don't necessarily test anything, but if it needs to test something, I need to add this little annotation. Each method's gonna look pretty simple. This one just says public void test. It's gonna be an object method, no class methods are needed. When I execute this class, I don't actually need a main method. It's just gonna run all of the tests in a certain way. So this is the one situation where I have a Java class with no main method, but I can hit run on it. Actually, I can hit run on it now. And what it does in Eclipse, which is really nice, there's nothing actually in the console because I don't have anything here yet. It's gonna execute this test method. It shows me the name of the class, test.labCalculatorTest. It opened up this JUnit view over here on the side. This might be a default. I'm not actually sure if it does it on the side or in the bottom corner or whatever by default. But I think I set up your VDIs to be about the same thing. So it should flip your package explorer. Don't worry, it's right here still. It should flip from this view to this new JUnit tab and show you each method that's in there, how long it took to run that method, and whether or not it passed. So obviously from the big red bar, it didn't pass, right? Bad things happened. So this is a great test. Just to make sure that everything's working, this is the hello world of JUnit tests, basically, almost. It's kind of making sure that everything's set up in your class and in your project. So I know that it didn't work because there's a little gray X here on this method, and there's a gray X in this test class, and there's a big old red bar. So that's a problem. The reason that it failed was because we literally called something called fail, which is a handy one of our test cases. So when you come into your method, you might be testing for certain things. This is where you're going to use that conditional execution again, if statements. So you're going to come in and say, if something's not the way that it should be, fail. And when you fail, you're going to pass in a method of some, or a message of some sort. So the message that we want to say was not yet implemented, and then you'll notice that over here in the failure trace, we have a java.lang.assertion error. Assertion errors are what come out of fail. When you call fail and you pass in a message, you're going to get an assertion error. We did this on purpose. It's just like Java assert. So we had the assert statements, we're going to use them again here in a second. We made sure that if something wasn't true, we failed. In this case, we're just not even checking if anything's true. We're just saying no, fail, just by default. And that's the default kind of hello code. After that, it's going to say your message, so your customized message. That way, if you have maybe 60 different methods in here that you're testing out, 30 different things, you know exactly which one it is because you created a customized message for each one. And maybe you say why it failed. So this is really important just for being able to test out your code. This isn't doing anything at runtime. It's actually going to be ignored by your code in production. So your user's never going to see anything like this. But if you work in a small shop, it'll be your job to create these unit tests for all of your classes. If you work in a big shop, like a large employer, like USAA or HEB or some of those, it's somebody's actual job to create all of these unit test cases. So you'll just be meeting with the person and telling them everything that could possibly go wrong. And they're going to make notes and then a really long test case kind of class. Or somebody's going to meet with you and you're going to create a test case class, whatever kind of job you're going to go. So that's how we look at it in Eclipse. Let's go back just a little bit. So again, this may be the way that you see it in your VDI. So your VDI may only give you two options at the very top, JUnit 3 test or JUnit 4 test. You want to pick 4 or 5, so one of those two. And then it should automatically populate everything that you need. So, declaring the default methods that you need for your class, it's going to go ahead and do that automatically. You don't have to worry about any of the buttons in here. But we do want to test up, talk about which one of these method stubs it could auto-generate for you. So it has a question just below superclass where it says, which method stubs would you like to create? Set up before class, set up, tear down after class, or tear down. So those are a few things that we need to talk about. First, I want to talk about annotations. So the very first annotation we just saw was the at test. That's your bare minimum. If it's going to be a JUnit test case, you have to have at least one test inside of your test case, which kind of makes sense. So there has to be one method that says at test at the very top of it. And that's going to get executed when there's a test to be run. The other ones can be grouped pretty easily, but I'm going to skip all the way to the bottom first, and we'll talk about this at ignore. So the @ignore tag or ignore annotation means that you're in the middle maybe of writing a unit test case, but you're not quite ready for it, but your friend or colleague or whatever really needs you to commit your code to GitHub, for example. So you're gonna put, instead of @test, you're gonna put @ignore so that when they run the JUnit test case, it doesn't fail because your code's not done yet. The code still has to compile. So your stuff still needs to compile. You have to comment out anything that doesn't compile. But if you're in the process of testing something or creating a test for something and it's not quite ready yet, we put ignore on it. And then that way, other developers know to ignore it, and the JUnit test, when it runs, knows to ignore it as well. So test and ignore, so on or off, basically, for your JUnit tests. The other ones are going to be before you run that test and after you run that test. So there's 2 for before and 2 for after. The first one for before is going to be just before each test. So let's say you have 5 test methods inside your JUnit test case. And before each one of those tests, you need something to be set up. So let's say we're testing out the ebook reader, and I want to make sure that there's a library in there first, and then the method test to see if Sherlock Holmes is in there. And we know it is, so it's testing to make sure everything's okay. Then the next test may look for a book that we know is not in there, and before that method runs, you also want to make sure that there's a library set up, and everything's kind of initialized for you the way that you think it is. So if that's the case, if before every single one of those tests you want to run something, you're going to use the @before tag. So that's going to be the second one in the list here. So it's going to be before each method. Let's pop back over to Eclipse because it's a little bit easier to see. So let's say I'll go ahead and add my lab calculator test. If I use this @before, it means that I'm going to have something, and again, these all need to be imported. So I need to import from org.junit. I'm actually just going to do this because we're going to need to do it for each one of them. Might as well take everything at once. So @before, I can have a public void before method. What we call our before methods setup. That's just a term that everybody uses. So before you execute some sort of a test, you want to set up everything that you need for that test. So here, I'm going to put a little to-do first. Set up anything required for each test method. So this runs before every test method. So before test runs, so if I had multiple tests, let's say I have another test. Let's add another test in here. So test 2. Test 2 is also going to fail. What's going to happen when I execute this class is first it's going to execute setup, and then it'll execute test. And then it'll execute setup, and then it'll execute test 2. So setup will run before every test that we have. We have a similar one actually called before class, so I could do the same kind of thing. I usually put it at the very top. And it's called setup, and we usually call it before class or setup class. So same kind of thing, I'm still going to use it before, but I use the before class annotation to indicate it should run once before the entire JUnit test class runs. And that's it. It doesn't run before each method. It just runs before the entire set of tests run. We don't have to use all of these annotations, and if it's kind of confusing or you decide that I'd rather have before or before class or one or the other, that's okay too. You don't have to have all of these. The only one that's really required is test. Test is super important because it's the only thing that actually tests anything inside of this setup. So let's say before class, in this case, set up anything required for all test methods runs once before anything else in this class. So the difference between before class and before, or setup before class and setup, or the fact that setup's only going to run before every single test, and before class, or setup before class, runs just once. Are there any questions? questions on this one before I move forward? Does this kind of make sense? All right. So if this makes sense, the same thing happens for after. So we have the same kind of thing for after, but we call them tear down. So I'm going to do a same thing I would have done here for setup, except we'll call this one tear down. And the tag on it's going to be after. And this is going to be tearing down anything required for each test method. And it runs just after each test method. So each and every test method is going to run, and then we're going to call after our tear down method to clean up anything that happened afterwards. So these are great, and you don't necessarily need it in this course, but in software engineering, you'll use setup, for example, to connect to a database, do your test, and then tear down to disconnect from your database. That kind of makes sense? In here, we just have files, so you're just kind of doing file I/O, so you really don't need to do that as much. But if you were testing out a database to make sure that you had the right data in there, you had the right setup, you'd be setting up the database connection first, doing your test, and then tearing it down. And then similarly, there's also something called after class, not an after school special. We have after class, so it tears down everything required for all test methods. And this runs once after entire class is finished. So tear down after class, or the after class tag, runs just once, and it'll tear down anything that you need. So in most of your JUnit test classes, you're not going to have all these methods. You're going to have maybe a before, a whole bunch of tests, and then an after. Or a before class, a whole bunch of tests, and an after class. But you have the option to include all of these things. So if you do need something set up a certain way, or something is just not working out right, or if you find yourself repeating the same code inside of a lot of your test classes, like setting up database connections, or setting up files, or checking to see if a file exists, or things like that, all of those things should be kind of into one of these setup and tear down kind of methods. All right, so this is what this little slide has, all the annotations. We had the test, before class, after class, and ignore. Ignore is the only one I didn't code in there. It just gets ignored. It gets thrown out by the compiler, so you won't really need it as much. But it is handy if you're working together and you're using GitHub. So those are JUnit annotations, and what we can do is, if you hit next in that wizard, so before I just hit finish. I just cheated and kind of went through, because we were going to do it manually. We just created all those classes or methods manually. But Eclipse lets you auto-generate this stuff, which is really handy, especially because I don't need you